topic of this video is positivism, and it's an introduction, a brief introduction to a way of viewing the world and evaluating information. It's a methodology, a process by which we understand what we observe, and it's been quite advanced, and it now helps us with how we measure things, how we conceptualize research problems, and how we understand the answers. So in positivism, it all starts with looking at theory and hypotheses. Many of you have taken a course already in sociological theory. So theory explains the kinds of things that we see and helps us make predictions about what we should see. One example of this is Granovetter's notion of strength of weak ties. And in Granovetter's work, he shows that individuals who have more weak ties have greater opportunities for finding jobs and for mobility, and that adoption of innovation is made difficult by strong ties. Of course, we need to know what weak and strong ties are. Weak ties are things like acquaintances, friends of friends. Strong ties might be family members. And he found, kind of paradoxically, that people who rely on their strong ties to find work don't do as well as those that also use their weak ties. And the reason for that is that people with strong ties tend to all have access to the same information. They know the same things. So there's no place for new information or it's difficult for new information to enter into their world. I think of this as, if you think of information as a pool of water that's spring-fed, if you have only strong ties, then this information, the water coming in, is fetid. There's not much water coming in. It's kind of a still pond. On the other hand, if you have friends of friends and maybe a girlfriend's mother or father, and you use them to help find jobs and to learn things about what's going on in the world, you're expanding your reach for information. And so here you have a very healthy pond with lots of spring water feeding in. So theories tend to be quite general. We'll give an example of this in a minute. And out of the theories, we develop hypotheses. Typically, you learn in a course like this, or in your next course, your methods course, that the hypothesis is an empirically testable statement about the relationship between two or more variables. And you need to move from theory to hypotheses. So a theory kind of points you in a general direction, and the hypothesis is much more concrete and speaks to about the kind of outcome you think you will find. With a hypothesis, we can then test whether that hypothesis is false or not. Of course, to test anything empirically, we have to measure things. And so the next part of this positivist process is the measurement phase. Measurement, there's lots of pitfalls with measurement, but basically here's what goes on. You decide you're going to measure something, and so you're going to come up with a rule that defines what you observe, and then based on that rule assign a number. So for example, we might be measuring gender, and we observe that people are either male or female by the way they look, and then we assign them a value of 1 for men and 0 for women. Or we could have assigned the other way around, 0 for men and 1 for women. In this particular case, gender, the order, the 0, 1, who gets assigned the 0, 1 doesn't matter. What matters is that we have a rule that's understandable and can be applied routinely and consistently. Gender provides an interesting example because gender these days is really not just male and female. There may be a genetic gender that may be identifiable, but social scientists tend to, I guess we call that sex, but sociologists tend to be interested more in gender, and often this involves how people see themselves, how they experience their world. And I said we were going to measure gender by observing people and noting whether they were male or female, and of course the ability to do that rests on the judgment that an individual can make. And I may be wrong. I may assess somebody as being male when they feel like they're female and they act like they're female. I may misidentify their gender. So we may need better ways of measuring these kinds of things. And I'm really just pointing out that measuring things is a lot harder than it seems at first. That there's a fair amount of complexity, and you have to think through what you think you're measuring and what you're actually measuring. Once you have talked about how you're going to measure things, you actually have to go out and collect your data. So now we're in the data collection phase. And this is the topic of a course like SOCY 202, the course most of you will take in the next semester or two. Again, this is kind of a science in its own right. That is, it's how do we collect data in a way, how do we produce data in a way that doesn't contaminate the data and makes them as good as possible. This involves solving issues like what's our population and how do we sample from it? What is our data collection procedure? Are we doing observational work? Are we using surveys? Are we using self-reports, people keeping diaries, things like that? With the data in hand, we get to the kind of material that we would do in this course, which is our analysis phase. So here we're going to use some math because this is an empirical course. There are other kinds of analyses, qualitative analyses. Again, you'll learn that in your next course. But we're going to stick to the quantitative statistical work. And here we use probability to help us understand and interpret the data that we've measured and collected based on our theories and hypotheses to allow us to answer very specific kinds of questions. This process is really a bit of a gestalt. That is, these pieces tend to be larger than their individual, the sum of these pieces is larger than the individual pieces themselves. Unfortunately, in most educational settings, we tend to break these into separate courses. So I mentioned that many of you have already taken a sociological theory course. In graduate school, you will find courses on measurement, courses on data collection, roughly called methods courses, and then you'll have the required statistics courses. Many departments, graduate programs, will require at least 2 statistics courses, at least 2 methods courses, and at least 1 theory course, and in some cases a measurement course. The problem with this is that it tends to separate these pieces, and we lose sight that this is a process. If we fail or do poorly at any one part of this positivist process, then the rest of our analysis suffers. For example, if our theory is merely silly, then anything we generate from that, the hypotheses, which then lead us to do certain kinds of measurements and maybe use a particular kind of data collection, everything downstream of that will be suspect. And there's no amount of statistical work that you can do that can correct a study that is ill-conceived theoretically, or data that were measured incorrectly, or data that was collected inappropriately. So it's important that these things be understood as a whole and that they work together to produce the best kinds of data to allow statistical analysis. Now, for a quick example, we're going to turn to the General Social Survey. Generally, this positivist model, as we start up with theory and move through measurement, data collection, and analysis, we go through several levels of abstraction. We start at a very general or abstract level. We move to a very specific or concrete level, and then we end up kind of back at that general and abstract level. So this slide and the one after it will walk us through that process with a simple-minded example. So for example, at our most general level, we're going to talk about a theory. A theory might involve several statements, in this case summarizing or making an argument that proximity is related to social intimacy. Notice here that I have not defined proximity, nor have I defined social intimacy. Proximity could mean emotional closeness. It could mean physical closeness. It could mean geographical closeness. In other words, at our most abstract level, our concepts are defined very generally. Same thing with social intimacy. Social intimacy could be sharing information with another person or sleeping with another person. So we're going to take this general theory that proximity is related to social intimacy, and we're going to develop a hypothesis out of it. So here's my hypothesis. If there is opportunity, notice here I'm using the word opportunity, substituting it for the word proximity. If there is an opportunity, then people will have sex more frequently. Now, to be more specific about this, marital status will be related to sexual frequency. People who are married will have sex more frequently on average than unmarried people. That's my hypothesis. I don't know if this is true or not, but my theory leads me to believe that it might be true. And so I'm going to go out and now test this. Well, how am I going to measure these things? I need 2 variables. One variable is called about how often did you have sex during the last 12 months. In the General Social Survey, the mnemonic for this variable is SEXFREQ, sex freak. sexual frequency. People could respond between 1 and 6. So here's an example of this variable, the frequency distribution of this variable. 0 means not at all, 1 means once or twice, 2 means once a month, and so forth. Notice that we have some measurement issues here as well. For example, the value 6 means 4+ times per week. So this is for people who report having sex relatively frequently, but yet it's an undefined number. It's 4 or more times a week. Similarly, we ask people, option number 3, 2 to 3 times a month. Again, this is a relatively imprecise number. So notice that when we talked about measurement on the slide before in the positivist model, we have an issue with this particular variable. This variable requires that people have good recall about their sexual behavior, that they remember what they have done during the past year and able to make a reasonably good estimate of it. It relies on the fact that people be honest with us, that people neither inflate nor deflate their particular estimate of their sexual frequency. It requires that everybody use the same definition of what sex is, and that's not clear that people do that. So while this measurement is the one we're going to use, and it's available in the General Social Survey, so I like using this particular variable, understand that to some extent it's not exactly clear what it is we're measuring. The other variable is our marital status variable. And here people were asked, are you currently married, widowed, divorced, separated, or have you never been married? And we can see here that the values available are 1 through 5 for married, widowed, divorced, separated, and never married, 9 for not available or didn't answer. We can look at the frequency distribution of these particular measures, that is how many people responded in each category, and get a sense of who falls in what category. And we're going to attempt to relate these two variables to each other using a particular statistical test. Okay, so now we're at a pretty concrete level. We've gone from this general abstract level of posing a large theoretical perspective, becoming a bit more concrete, and out of that perspective, developing a set of one hypothesis that's we think is answerable. And then we've gone out and collected or gotten our hands on some data, the General Social Survey, which we'll use through most of this course. Now we move to our analysis section, and again, that's the kind of stuff we're going to learn in this particular statistics course. We discover that people who are married have sex an average of 78 times a year, while unmarried people have sex on average 53 times a year. So we observe that there is a difference, and it's in the direction that we predicted. That is, people with proximity or access tend to have sex more frequently, more social intimacy, have sex more frequently than people who are not married. We calculate what's called a t-test or a t-statistic. We'll learn about that later. We get a value of 7.29, which is indicating that there's a statistically important difference between these two averages, that we don't think that's due to chance or sampling error, but it's due to a real difference in behavior across people in these two different kind of categories, married versus not married. So with that piece of information at hand, we can then move back to a more general level and look at our hypothesis. Our hypothesis, the way we stated it, the way we measured our data, the way we collected our data and then analyzed it, we get some support for this hypothesis. We can't reject it. So we think it may be true given how our procedures that we followed. So at this point, the theory looks pretty good to us. It may not work in all different kinds of settings or measuring intimacy or proximity in different ways, but in this kind of narrow, concrete way, we have some sense that the theory works as predicted. Well, that's it in a nutshell. I hope you enjoyed this lecture, and we will be back with more a little bit later.